Welcome to the CompTIA Security Plus lecture review. Here we're looking at the book CompTIA Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals 5th edition. This is going to be for SY0401. So this is not the current exam, which is the 501. So if you do keep that in mind, make sure you're taking the right exam. This happens to be Chapter 15, Vulnerability Assessment, which is the last chapter in this book. So, moving forward. The main part of this chapter is to look at vulnerability assessments and explain why they're important. Explain the differences between the vulnerability scanning and pen testing. We're going to describe implementation and integration of third-party services. And we're going to look at techniques for mitigating and deterring or avoiding attacks. So, first step in any security protection plan begins with an assessment of vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities do you know about? Which ones are there? And what can we do about them? So a variety of techniques and tools can be used in evaluating the levels of vulnerabilities, with some of the most common actually being a vulnerability scanning tool. Nessus, for example, Nessus, is one of the big companies that provide a lot of these tools. However, they are not cheap tools. There are some open source versions out there, so do keep that in mind. So, what is a vulnerability assessment? Vulnerability assessment, and we have to look at understanding how to explain why it's important, explain the differences. We already covered that. Sorry, I went the wrong way. So, what is a vulnerability assessment? It's a systematic and methodical evaluation of assets exposed to attackers, 1, forces of nature, 2, items outside of our control, and any other potential harmful entity. So we have 3 major areas of exposure. The aspects of a vulnerability assessment include asset identification, threat evaluation, vulnerability appraisal, risk assessment, and risk mitigation. Risk is going to make up a huge portion of the vulnerability assessment as we are looking at evaluation of exposure. So asset identification is the process of inventorying items and understanding their monetary value. Common assets could be like people, any type of physical assets. Data/information is a heavy-based asset. Any type of hardware and or software, intellectual property, things like of that nature are going to be assets that we're looking for measuring. So after inventory, it's important to determine relative values of those items. So when we're looking at determining value, we're looking at how critical an asset could be to the organization. So this gets more complicated when we're talking about people, because people also need to be included in this. How difficult is it to replace that asset? How much revenue does that asset generate? Again, people can be assets. And the impact of the assets on availability to the organization, and what could that cost, potentially. Some organizations assign a numerical value, like 5 through 1 or 1 through 5, as examples. Threat evaluation. We want to list the potential threats from common threat agents. And again, a threat agent is any person or thing or item with the power to carry out a threat against an asset. So when we're looking at threat evaluation, we're looking at all of the assets we've identified, and then we're looking at potential threats against that asset. So there is a model called threat modeling with the goal to understand the attackers and their methodology, and it's often done by constructing a threat scenario off certain assets. There's also what's called a attack tree, and this will provide the visual representation of a potential attack drawn as inverted tree structure. There's also what's called a kill chain. A kill chain is a common structure that attackers use to complete a task. For example, there is a specific structure as it relates to malware, as it relates to virus creation. Alright, so the attack tree commonly looks like this. This is an attack tree for stealing a car radio. Here is an attack tree for logging into a restricted account. So categories of threat could be things like espionage, extortion, error, software glitch, theft, utility interruptions, compromising of intellectual property, natural disaster, failure of equipment, so forth. Next, we have a vulnerability appraisal, and this will determine the current weaknesses. This will be a snapshot of the current organization's security as it relates in that snapshot in time. Now keep in mind, if you snapshot today and you review it tomorrow, it's not tomorrow's weaknesses, it's going to be looking at the snapshot overall security. Because when you do this, you want to make sure that it's at a relatively plateau stage, meaning that if you're changing security procedures tomorrow and you snapshot it today, the snapshot's not going to be valid because your more current security was implemented the day after the snapshot. Every asset should be viewed in light of each threat. You want to categorize each vulnerability and include a likelihood. Moving forward, we have what's called a risk assessment, and this will help to determine the damage that might result or could result from an attack. You're going to assess the likelihood that the vulnerability is a risk, and you're going to review the more common likelihoods. For example, I live in Las Vegas, and a tsunami is a potential vulnerability. However, the likelihood of that vulnerability is fairly low. So we don't really have to consider that as a primary thing to review. We may review it next year, but again, the likelihood controls or dictates what items we will control or what items we will review. So an impact scale could be like no impact, small impact, major, catastrophic, significant, and then there should be a way to rank them. Risk mitigation is about determining what to do about risk. We can identify assets, threats. We can kind of see what we want to do with them. Part of the risk mitigation is, again, what to do with the risk. Can we mitigate it? Can we transfer it? Do we just accept it? Moving forward, baseline reporting. Baseline is, again, just a fake imaginary line that we can measure against. 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, it's the degree that is below freezing. Why is it 0? Just because when we did our measurements of temperature, it became 0. 0 is not freezing. 0 Fahrenheit is below freezing. 32 degrees Fahrenheit is freezing. That's also 0 Celsius. Again, that example just to show you it's an imaginary, made-up number that we can measure against. That's it. Part of being able to do a baseline is creating checklists against which the system can then be evaluated or audited against that baseline. Baseline reporting is again a comparison of the current state and then relate it back to that baseline state. There should be differences. Well, realistically, there should be no differences in an ideal world. If there are differences, you should note them, evaluate them, and then, if necessary, correct them. Software program development, importance to minimize vulnerabilities during the SDLC. This has some challenges because software application development has different sizes and complexities, which make building secure code at the SDLC a lot harder. And again, there is no real formal specifications, and there's also no understanding of what future attacks will hold, so that makes this really complicated to do. Also, the requirements. If we're looking at SDLC assessment techniques, if we're looking at an actual list of requirements, we need to understand what features are needed along with the appropriate guidelines for maintaining a specific level of quality, and then we review the design or architectural makeup of the software so we can make sure it works. For example, we once helped with a database creation for a reservation system. There were no requirements other than we had to be able to use the database to make reservations. However, the database itself started lacking basic security, and then they wanted also to have the database process credit cards. And then it's like, wait, well, it wasn't really designed to do that, and we just kept stacking more and more stuff into it, and then in product was actually a database that really didn't meet the needs anymore. So the overall requirements for the database got skewed and then stopped functioning. Then it stopped working as it was leaking credit card information, and that just became more of a nightmare. Implementation, understanding while the code is being written, it's being analyzed by reviewers. We're also looking at how the code could be attacked, if it could be attacked. We're going to go through some type of verification and quality assurance phase to make sure there is no errors or bugs. And then there should be a release. And the release is actually the shipping of the software. There should be support for the software if vulnerabilities are found, or if a risk is associated with the software is found, or just general updates for the software. There should be support. Here is a graphical representation of our SDLC. Requirements, design, implementation, verification / quality assurance, release, and then any type of continual support to make it better. Moving on, for assessment tools as it relates to networking, we have port scanners for TCP communication. Port numbers, again, are a unique identifier for applications and services, typically 16 bits in length. This is all general network plus material, but somewhat kind of important. Well-known ports are between 0 and 1023, so essentially the first 1024 ports are well-known ports. Again, we start with 0 for counting. Registered ports are going to be 1024 through 49,151. And then lastly will be those dynamic ports, and that's going to be 49,152 through the remainder open ports 65,535. Again, that's all generic networking material. Common ports that you should understand are things like FTP, DNS, HTTP, HTTPS, NetBIOS, SFTP, and so forth. RDP, port 3389 is a common one. Web traffic, port 80. IMAP, 110. POP3 is 110. IMAP is 143, and so forth. Understanding what ports are being used for are important. Also understanding when a port is open as closed and or blocked, and what do they mean. Normally open means they're responding. Close means there could already be a connection state that are connected to that port, and then blocked, that's not going to be responsive at all. Tons of port scanners out there to help kind of set apart some of the other ones. You can do a graphical port scan, or you can do a command line port scan. Nmap is a really great scanning tool, but it's command line only. The graphical tool is Zenmap. Here we're using the Advanced Port Scanner version 1.3. And this is just one type. There are plenty of port scanners out there, just kind of seeing which one best fits your need. We have different types of scanning. We have an Xmas tree port scan. We have a fin scan, a sync scan, a connect scan. The connect scan is an attempt to connect to every available port, and if the port's open, the operating system will complete the handshake, assuming it's TCP. If we're looking at TCP sync scanning, instead of using the operating system's networking functions, the port scanner will generate an IP packet and monitor for response. The port scanner generates a sync pack, and if the target port is open, the port will respond with a sync ACK, starting that three-way handshake. If we are looking at a fin scan, the port scan will send a finish packet, and without sending the initial sync packet, a closed port will reply, but an open port will just ignore it. There are different ways to see this operational state of a port by doing different types of scanning. Lastly, a Xmas tree port scan is a packet that every option is set to on for whatever protocol is in use, and when used for scanning, the TCP header of an Xmas tree packet has the flags finish, urgent, and push all set to on, and we can observe how the host will respond to this odd packet and then make assumptions based off of that. You can actually help determine operating system by using the response. As we move forward, let's talk about things like a banner grab. So banner grabbing is essentially grabbing a banner. A banner is a message that a service will transmit when another program contacts it. So for example, the banner of an HTTP web service will typically show the type of web server it is, version number, when it was last modified, and other information like that. Again, banner grabbing would be a program that is used to intentionally gather this information. This can be used as an assessment tool to help perform an inventory of the services and systems operating system and to see kind of what's responding. We have what's called the protocol analyzer. So protocol analyzers look at both hardware and software, and a protocol analyzer could be both hardware or software, and it is made to capture packets. These packets can then be used to decode and analyze the contents of these packets. While this is typically known also as a sniffer, there are other tools out there that aren't just sniffers. Wireshark is a common example. Common uses for these analyzers, honestly, investigations, security analysis. If we want to characterize the network traffic to kind of see what's happening, this helps us better fine-tune network management, network administration, network bandwidth, network shaping, and to see if we have to implement other services like quality of service. Here is Wireshark. I've done a huge video selection on Wireshark already, so if that's something you're interested in, check out those videos. Purposes for the protocol analyzer: it could be built into the firewall monitor, it could be built in to help look at virus or malware detection, maybe look at unauthorized application and services on the network. If you start seeing ports that are responding on addresses that they shouldn't be, or maybe unnecessary network traffic, you start looking at streaming services, and their acceptable use policy for the organization says no streaming service, yet you're capturing packets from several PCs, and they're clearly streaming services. That could be a legitimate use for this. Alright, moving on, we have our vulnerability scanners. And again, this is a generic term for a range of products. Most of them will maintain a database that categorizes and describes the vulnerabilities they can detect, a common vulnerability index, a CVE. If you Google CVE vulnerability, you'll actually get a massive government database that has all of the vulnerabilities, what operating systems they affect, characteristics, if there's fixes and patches, and so forth. Here is one type of vulnerability scanner. Again, the purpose of them, they can alert when new systems are added, they can detect applications when they're compromised. That's more of a stretch. They can detect when an internal system begins to port scan other systems. They can detect which ports are serving what services, and they can identify applications and servers that are transmitting sensitive data. These are possibilities, not that they all can do this, but a lot of them can. You get what you pay for. Keep that in mind. Not all vulnerability scanners are created equal. They can also maintain logs. They can both passive and actively determine OS types. They can track applications and vulnerabilities within those applications, and they can also track communication. Problems with these assessment tools is there's no standard for them or reporting them, so that's an issue. So we have what's called OVAL, the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language. And here, this is a really good tool to kind of help design and promote open and public available security content and standards, and it really kind of tries to standardize this information as it transfers across different security tools and services. Here's an example of an OVAL outputs. Again, open source. This is not the best option out there, but this is at least the beginning of trying to standardize them. Moving on, we have what's called a honeypot and honey-nets. A honeypot could be a device that's protected by minimal security intentionally and might have BS data. Basically, you make it a soft target so that someone breaks into your network, they can go after this instead of actual machines. The goal is to trick the attackers into revealing their technique so you can defend against them. A honey net is a fake network that's set up. Again, that's a little bit softer than everything else, so that the attacker will go after that instead of the real network. Part of the vulnerability assessment is about the vulnerability scanning and the penetration scanning. These two activities are very similar, and more often than not, they get used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. A vulnerability scan is an automated software search through a system known as security weaknesses. It should create a report, and it should be compared against the baseline scan, usually performed from the inside security perimeter. It doesn't interfere with normal network operations. That's really important. Doesn't interfere with normal operations and is done from the inside. Two methods for performing a vulnerability scan: intrusive and non-intrusive. Intrusive vulnerability scan attempts to actually penetrate the system to perform a simulated attack. A non-intrusive scan uses only the available information to hypothesize the status of the vulnerability. Normally when I do this, I'm doing intrusive scans with permission. We also have what's called a credentialed vulnerability scan, and this helps provide credentials, usernames, and passwords to the scanner to test for additional internal vulnerabilities. We have a non-credentialed scan, and this does not use credentials. Types of scan, again, intrusive, non-intrusive. You can go through the advantages and disadvantages. Moving past this, we have our penetration test. This is designed to exploit weaknesses on all sides. This does rely on the tester's skill, usually conducted by an independent contractor outside the network, a third party, and it tests the usual aspects from outside the network. This may disrupt operations. The end report, or the end result, should be a report. What was able to be done? Were they able to get in? How did they get in? Pen testing comes in a few flavors: white, black, and gray. White, that you have in-depth knowledge. Black, you have no knowledge. Gray, you have limited knowledge. Terms could be things like frequency, goals, testers, locations, tools, reports, costs, and value. Third-party integration is, I believe, one of the last major topics we discuss. And this is combining systems and data with outside entities. With the increase of cloud platforms, we see a lot more third-party integration. The risk of third-party integration, though, includes things like onboarding and offboarding. Onboarding is the start of the relationship between partners. Offboarding is the termination of such an agreement. Application and social media network sharing. We had a huge section on social media. And again, so keep in mind social media could be a concern. Privacy and risk awareness, and data consideration. How do we classify and identify that data? And that is a huge concern. Since we're talking third party, we also need to talk about things such as service level agreement, blanket purchase agreement, memorandum of understanding, and the interconnection security agreement. These are three major areas of protection. What level of service do we agree upon? What basic memorandum of understanding? What do we all understand this relationship is about? And then lastly, the interconnect security assessment. What are we going to be allowing? What base level of security is permitted? So, mitigating and deterring attacks. The goal here is the standard techniques for mitigating and deterring attacks are creating the appropriate security posture for your industry, for your size, and so forth. Having both change management and configuration management so you can have selecting and configuration controls that are a little bit more up to speed and appropriate for the industry. Device hardening. That includes hardware and software hardening, and that makes sure that the attack surface of a given system or hardware platform is as secured as it should be. Lastly, reporting. You should always have reports on the general security of the organization so that you can find holes, you can find gaps, and fix them as necessary. The security posture should describe and approach the philosophy and the strategy that the organization has regarding security. Elements should be things like the baseline, continual security monitoring, how we observe the systems and the network, and remediation for the vulnerabilities that they should know that they're exposed to. How are they being addressed? That can come in terms of things like confidentiality, integrity, availability, safety, authorization, authentication, and so forth. Alright, moving on, configuration controls. Proper configuration is the key to mitigating attacks, deterring attacks, deflecting attacks, detecting, being proactive, and making sure you're not a target of attacks. For detection, for example, security cameras. For prevention, having the appropriate position of security guards. So information security controls can be configured to both detect and prevent attacks depending on the type of attack. Part of the types of attack should be part of those assessments we discussed earlier in this chapter. When a normal function is interrupted by a failure, we should also understand how to recover. How large of a priority is it? How secure is the rest of the organization because of that failure? And again, part of those are the assessments that we've outlined earlier. If we fail to open a lock that's unlocked automatically upon failure, how secure is that? If there's a fail-safe lock that automatically locks, how secure is that? A good example is, in case of a fire, the fail-safe locks should automatically unlock. Fire, you don't want to lock people in, so the door should unlock. However, does that create a vulnerability? Hardening. The purpose of hardening is to eliminate as much risk as possible, or to mitigate as much risk as possible. Types of hardening should be proactive accounts with passwords, disabling inappropriate accounts and services, and protecting the management interface and applications when possible. Reporting, so that action can be taken. Alarms or alerts, that way if an issue does occur, the appropriate individual can have a report that an alarm or a report happens. The reports provide information on trends, and it could be as simple as failed password attempts. Alright, well, that is the last chapter in a nutshell. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. And again, understand that security is all around the organization. It's not one department, it's not one individual, it's company-wide, top down from management. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. Thank you. You guys have a great day.